This is.
This is a joint hearing between the Senate Finance Committee and the House Ways and Means Committee. Today is Tuesday, February 18th. Really glad to be here with all of you and appreciate that we're finding something of a rhythm with doing this every Tuesday together. So we have two different agenda items today. One is Julia Richter is joining us again. She gave separate presentations to the separate committees on grand list values, and we've jointly asked her to update some of those numbers, do a little bit more analysis. And so she's going to share that with us today. And then we have Jake Feldman joining us to talk a little bit more about the state guarantee proposal from the administration. I think that is it for all the words I have.
No, I'm having trouble getting, does anyone else? I can't get the committee page to open up here. So.
First, it might be a little bit full.
What is it? The in-house network, it's not working, so I moved to the, some people are on their computers, my iPad says it can't load. If you say that again.
So in one moment, we get our tech problems resolved.
That's fine.
You're
I've got the agenda and my notebook, so
Okay.
we're good to go.
Connection is not working on the internet, but the State House public connection
Okay.
is.
I've seen.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Julia Richter with Joint Fiscal Office. I'm wearing a mask because I'm a little under the weather, but I have tested negative for COVID. I guess that's now on the record, but. So I'm happy to take off my mask if people are having trouble understanding me. Leave it up to all of you.
I know, right?
Guys, would you like me to,
I'd love you to begin your presentation. Thank you so much.
I was joining the Zoom. So while I'm setting up my screen and joining the Zoom, there is a slide deck posted on the committee, both committee pages under my name. As the chair mentioned, in both of your committees, I reviewed a grand list analysis of the 5 districts proposed by the administration. Both committees asked for me to come back with a little bit more analysis into further splitting of the grand list. So I was asked to follow the Vermont School Boards Association's boundaries. Talk about it in more detail here. All right. So I've been asked to focus on the Vermont School Board Association, their regions. And we're going to be talking through a grand list and a pupil analysis of those regions. Before getting started, just a reminder, you all know JFO is a nonpartisan legislative office dedicated to unbiased analysis. So this is not meant to serve as any sort of policy recommendation, but rather to just provide some information for legislative consideration. So it's a similar structure to what I've presented in both of your committees before with the 5 district analysis. But what we're going to do is walk through some of the underlying pieces of the analysis, focus on grand lists by these regions, the long-term average daily membership, grand list for long-term average daily membership, and then also some pupil demographic analysis, which I didn't present for the 5 districts before. So a few notes. We're looking at pupil counts, pupil demographics, and grand list values according to the VSBA regions. We'll talk about what those regions are here in a minute. Like before, we're using preliminary FY 25 equalized grand list value. We know that the term equalized refers to 100% of fair market value. So this is a way that we can compare from town to town, district to district, regardless of when they last appraised. We're also using FY 25 pupil counts as a way to be working off the same year. So the regions that we're going to be looking at, the Vermont School Boards Association divides the state into 11 regions. This quote is from their website, that it's for organization and administrative purposes and generally organized around the following counties. So you can see here the different regions and corresponding supervisory unions that fit into the regions. You'll see that there are the CTE regions included in the VSBA regions, but to be consistent with the other analysis that we looked at, I'm not including CTE here today. So we know that Vermont's grand list, it's the value of all property in the state that's subject to property tax. We know that the education property tax rate is for every $100 of property value. Like the prior analysis, the grand list value that we're looking at here today has not been divided by $100 as is consistent when looking at grand list values. We know that comparing grand list values across districts provides insight into those districts and regions and the amount of funds that could be raised locally on a certain tax rate. And we also know under current law that a district's property wealth does not impact its tax rate, right? Regardless of the property wealth of a district under current law, it will have the same property tax rate. Couple other assumptions before we get into the fun stuff. We know that under current law, school district boundaries and town boundaries do not always align. This means that in the state of Vermont, there are some towns that are part of 1, 2, or 3 school districts. So while school district, yeah.
I'm sorry.
Sure. So school district boundaries and town boundaries do not always align. And grand list values are separated by town boundary, not school district boundary. So in order to sort of reconcile these two differences where we have overlying boundaries, I've prorated towns' grand list values to a school district according to the percentage of its pupils that attend that school district. So this is what we do with tax rates under current law, right? If you have a town and 60% of its pupils go to District A and 40% of its pupils go to District B, then we're saying, okay, we're going to take 60% of its grand list to District A and 40% of its grand list to District B. This is a way of getting a sense of the grand list value within each school district. I've also included a note here because I know that we're in the detail and numbers committee, and so someone probably would notice if I didn't point it out. For the purpose of this analysis, I've excluded some GORs and unincorporated towns from the grand list, and that's because also with the purpose of prorating district tax rates, those are assigned $1. So we don't have the ratios that we need in order to prorate that grand list.
Representative, did you have a question about GORs?
No.
Oh, okay.
I gotta know. I know a bore. So what I'm wondering is, for purposes of taking a general look at how we're doing it, but do you think that it would be reasonable once, if we were to decide upon some strategy like this, to really look at which students really, because it's high school, special ed, it really might make a big difference. Would that be something that'd be difficult to do in this?
I'm sorry, what do you mean by looking at which?
Right now, you're talking about the percentage of pupils, but it might also be really important if we were to look at it, this kind of a thing. Which students, because it might be really different if there were mostly high school students or mostly elementary school students or.
So later on in the presentation, I actually have broken out by these regions, the demographics of students. So you can see within each of the regions, I don't know if this is getting to your question, but you can see within each of the regions, the grade cohort. We'll talk about English learner, and we'll talk about students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds.
I guess what I'm just trying to say is if we actually use this kind of methodology, then being specific from year to year might be a really important thing. And I'm wondering if that would make it really difficult to deal with from year to year or not.
Representative Odie, I think that's a great question. Can you hold going deeper on it?
All right.
Get to that section of the presentation.
Okay.
And I think I said this, but my brain is a little foggy. So in case I didn't say this, this is consistent with what we do with tax rates under current law. We use the percentage of pupils attending a district for the proration of tax rates. So I'll try to make this a hair bigger. So we're looking at here is the total equalized grand list across these regions, the VSBA regions. So what we can see here is the total equalized grand list value. This is that FY25 preliminary, but very close to final grand list data separated across the regions, and the percentage of total grand list value that would be apportioned to that region. We see that Central Vermont has the highest percentage of total grand list value at 15%. Kingdom North has the lowest at 4%. And Franklin Grand Isle is at the median. I've included a pie chart. Again, so this is showing the same information that we just saw in the table there, but you can see each one of these different slices is representing one of the different regions and its total equalized grand list value. Moving on into Homestead, we see this, it now shifts. It's different than when looking at the total equalized grand list. So now we're solely looking at the portion of the grand list that's homestead. We know that there's two manners of classifying property for the purpose of statewide education taxation. That's homestead property and non-homestead. Homestead is the principal dwelling and surrounding acreage. So that's what we're looking at here. We can see that Eastern Chittenden has the highest percentage of the state's homestead grand list at 16%, and that Kingdom North has the lowest percentage of the state's homestead grand list value at 3%, the median being Rutland. Moving on to non-homestead, we see things shift again. So now this is looking at the other piece of the grand list. So we looked at the total, then we looked at homestead, and now we're looking at non-homestead. Right, so non-homestead includes everything from businesses, deer camp, apartment buildings, second homes. And we see here that Central Vermont has the highest percentage of non-homestead grand list value at 16%. Addison has the lowest at 4%. And Bennington has the median at 8%.
Sort of an obnoxious question. Sorry. Are you seeing a big shift when you think about sort of the last clusters and these clusters? So before we were talking about Windham and Windsor counties together, and now they're separate, and was Windsor carrying a lot of that grand list or something like that?
That's an interesting question. I would need to pull up the other slide deck to refresh. I think that one of the pieces that we're seeing here that's interesting is you'll recall that in the prior 5-district model, all of Chittenden County was lumped together. So we saw that making up over 30% of the grand list. So I think the biggest change that stood out to me without directly comparing across the two slide decks is more even distribution across the different regions rather than concentration in one.
Thank you.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
So partly why you're splitting across homestead, non-homestead, is it because the administration, as far as your understanding, I know you won't speak for them, is possibly contemplating, or are we, as a policy matter, possibly contemplating a fixed non-homestead rate across the entire state and then a differential adjusted homestead rate for each individual district?
So those are all policy choices. I believe that the administration's proposal includes a uniform property tax rate.
Non-homestead and homestead?
I'm not sure. I know that Jake is coming in an hour, so he can speak to that better than I can. I will say that my reasoning for splitting out homestead, non-homestead, and total, in addition to being asked to do it by the chairs, is also, it tells us a lot, right? There are really significant policy choices that are made in terms of property taxation. So under current law, we have a uniform non-homestead rate, and we have this spending adjusted homestead rate. So as contemplating different property taxation strategies, whether moving to a uniform rate or maintaining an adjusted rate, the size of the grand list tells you a lot about what can be taxed in a certain region. So if we're talking about levying, for instance, with the state share, the guarantee that I know Jake will be talking about in a little bit, that's talking about a match, right, against the grand list value. But depending on what grand list we're looking at, you're going to see a different distribution across the state.
So from my perspective, there is not like a clear policy motive for it. It's actually just understandable. Do a better job.
Thank you.
If I may, one more piece of the puzzle is I'm often asked, what are the value of second homes in the state, or what are the value of apartment buildings in the state? And because there's not that consistent classification in our grand list, homestead and non-homestead is the most reliable buckets of information that we have to parse in a little bit deeper into our overall grand list and what it looks like. So we walked through the total grand list and then separated the homestead and non-homestead. So all of these percentages that I'm showing here, we looked at on the prior 3 slides, but I put them all here because I think it's really interesting to see how, depending, to Senator Titten's point, depending on which grand list chunk we're looking at, or if we're looking at the total grand list, the share that a region holds of a certain grand list differs. Right. So for instance, just looking at Eastern Chittenden, we see it has 12% of the statewide grand list, 16% of the statewide homestead grand list, and 9% of the statewide non-homestead grand list. And the same interpretation can be done for any of these regions. So moving forward and looking at long-term ADM across the VSBA regions. So a reminder, long-term average daily membership is essentially the count of students in a school or in a school district. It's what we use for the purpose of weighting. But what we're talking about here is the long-term ADM, sort of our best estimate about the count of students in each of these regions. In FY25, that count is 83,368, and that count has been declining over time. Again, I'm going with FY25 here to be consistent with our grand list data as well. So looking at the total long-term average daily membership, so essentially pupils across the state, we see again, this is varied across these regions. So we're seeing here, the FY 25 pupil count. We see here the state share of those pupils. So Addison having the lowest percentage of total long-term ADM of the state, and Central Vermont having the highest percentage at 14%. And again, this is based off of who is being included in each of these regions, right? Put it in a pie chart, same thing that we're looking at here, same colors. So now moving into equalized grand list per long-term ADM. You'll recall that this is a metric that we looked at before in testimony. This is taking the region or the district's total grand list and dividing it by its long-term ADM. And this is a way of having a more apples to apples comparison of how much grand list value per pupil, essentially. And this is the basis of part of the administration's state guarantee proposal. They're leveraging this figure, which is why I'm touching on it. One of the reasons why I'm touching on it here. Oh, I guess I put it in words. This is what we just talked about. And then we talked about this last week, but one way to compare the spread of grand list value per pupil is to divide the highest value by the lowest value. And this gives you sort of a range or figure against which you can compare how big of a range are we talking. So here we're starting again at the total equalized grand list per long-term ADM of the VSBA regions. And we see here that the ratio from the lowest total equalized value to the highest is 2.0. And we see that Addison has the median of total grand list value per pupil.
Julia, was that 2.0 the same as the last iteration we had of this?
The 5 districts.
With the 5 districts? I think it was 2.0.
That is a good question. I'm pulling up those slides. Yes. But in that, so we were talking about the 5 district analysis, the total equalized value per long-term ADM was a 2.0 spread, and that was between the lowest, which was the Northeast region, and the highest, which was the Southeast region.
Which is Wyndham, right?
Yes.
Wyndham.
Well, it's Wyndham, Windsor, the southeast in that one. In the old one. Yeah.
Thank you.
Going in deeper, going back to the homestead grand list now, and now looking at homestead grand list for long-term ADM. We see the ratio from the highest to the lowest of being 1.9, and that's comparing Eastern Chittenden and Kingdom North. Bennington, within the homestead grand list for long-term ADM, is at the median.
Just a question on the math, you're rounding up by the hundreds, right?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. So everything is rounded to 1 decimal point. For the ratios, for the grand list, no decimal points, but yes, it's all rounded. Mhm. So now doing the same thing, going from now, so we were at total, then homestead, and now we're at non-homestead, and again, we see a shift, right? Now we're looking at non-homestead per long-term ADM, and we see the ratio here is 3.1. between Wyndham and Franklin Grand Isle. And we see a median of Addison for non-homestead per long-term ADM. So now these are the comparison metrics that we are just looking at the prior slides of looking at the grand list value per long-term ADM, depending on how you split the grand list up, or if you're not splitting it. And I think what's really interesting to see here is that, again, depending on what you're looking at, it really matters, right? It's going to have a difference if you're looking which grand list you're looking at. So, that's it for, that's all I prepared for the grand list analysis. I was also asked to look into demographic analysis of pupils by these regions. So I looked at, I didn't know if I had a word slide, but essentially looking at grades and then looking at students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds and EL students.
Before you get to that, can you remind us what a high ratio would mean and what a low ratio would mean?
High ratio for,
Like in your last two slides?
sure. Absolutely. So a high ratio, like what a higher ratio, like we're seeing here, 3.1, this is higher than the ratio of 1.9. That means that there's a wider spread between the lowest grand list per pupil and the higher grand list per pupil. So if you were to have a ratio of 1.0, it would mean that there was no difference between the grand list value per long-term ADM of districts.
Higher number of grand lists per pupil, what does that mean?
Higher number of grand lists per pupil, like Wyndham here. So this means that we're calculating this by taking the total, or in this case, the non-homestead grand list of the Wyndham region and dividing it by the number of pupils. So the higher that number is, means the more grand list value per pupil than in other districts.
Which is important, right, for regulating against Brigham, so as to have somewhat equitable means to raise funds for each child. So that's why we're looking at that rate, we're interested in that ratio.
So I'm not going to speak to Brigham, but what I will say is that the state guarantee, essentially what it's doing is it's saying, okay, we've got these districts, we're calculating the grand list per pupil of these different districts. The districts below the median, right? The median, that's that middle point. So the districts below the median are going to get some sort of state share or state guarantee to bring them up to the median grand list per pupil. So what we're looking at here is how wide is that spread? How high above the median are some districts and how low below the median are other districts? And the wider that spread is, the more extreme the difference in grand list per pupil across the districts, right? So if you have a grand list per pupil that's really low compared to the median, to bring that district up to the median, the state is going to have to provide a lot more funding to that district to bring it up to the median.
So the funding would come from the districts that are above the median. Yeah, all right. Because they have to be brought down to the median, right?
That's also a policy choice.
We have a lot of time allocated for this, so, I'll go with
Yeah,
that.
no, let's go in.
So I take it the state guarantee is something that we're seeing from the administration soon, and you are, okay, next. And do you know in those conversations, and I'll save it for them as well, but instead of just bringing up those below, instead contemplating the ratio as some sort of equalizing factor on all of those, on the actual effective tax rate relative to the grand list, so that those with the the better weighted per pupil values would effectively just be equalized using that ratio of pupil to grand list value. Has that been contemplated in your discussions?
I don't know if that's been contemplated. That would be a policy choice, right? If how all of those mechanics of the state guarantee are a policy choice. So one piece that's worth noting is here, everything that we're looking at is grand list per long-term ADM. So the weights are not fitting into this. The weights are only fitting into the foundation formula. Allocations. The other piece is depending on where you are benchmarking, like within the administration's proposal, against the proposal is to benchmark against the median, right? That's also a policy choice. If you were to benchmark against the median or benchmark against the highest or benchmark against the lowest, or somewhere else. And then the other question as well is how does that, what are the mechanisms of that benchmark? How does it work, right? Are you bringing districts down? How are you bringing districts up? By bringing districts up, where are those funds coming from? Are those funds being raised from all districts? Are they being raised in another manner? It's all policy choices.
So if we assume that everyone is getting the same base formula with the weights attached, which is what I said, I understand they do. The grand list per pupil, that comes in with how you raise that initial amount of money, and then how you would equalize any ability to raise over and above that amount. So you have a state guarantee that it won't cost the low ratio, the districts with the lower ratio, more to raise an extra dollar than the higher. Is that okay?
Yeah, so I think what we're talking, there's a few pieces of the property tax puzzle here that we're talking about kind of all at the same time. One is how are you raising those foundation formula dollars and categorical aid and everything else that's certainly going out? That's one question. And then the second question is, what if school districts want to raise above the amount that they are receiving from the state? And the state guarantee is discussing that raising above however many dollars the school district is definitely receiving. So if a school district were to decide to spend above that base amount that they are receiving from the state, how would those dollars of that spending above be raised? And that's where the state guarantee conversation comes into play.
Because if none of the higher towns decide to raise above, then where do you get, yeah, okay, the money to equalize the lower towns that may?
Well, I mean, we can talk about this more when we get to the state guarantee, but I think one of the interesting things about that proposal is that the money to guarantee, the proposal sits now, is just in the full ed fund. And so everyone's paying for it all over the state through their regular property taxes. Which I think is an interesting part of, I think it's in some ways described as being sort of revenue neutral when it's not, from in my examination of it. But we can, Jake will be here soon.
See, now,
Does anyone have anything else for Julia before we go to the next slide?
this is helpful.
So we've looked at grand list, we've looked at grand list per pupil, And now digging into regions, what do the pupil demographics look like within the region? So first, I know there's a lot of numbers on the slide, but a lot of stuff to look at. So what we're looking at here is the count of students from different grades by these regions. So you'll know that the largest cohort of students is in grades K through 5, but we also know this is the widest range for grades.
That is helpful to point that out. Thank you.
Yeah. I've also suppressed EEE student counts, which if you're noticing that the total numbers are not lining up to what we were looking at before, that's because EEE is not sitting in here. And there's no weights being applied. These are actually the counts that are used in the weighting file upon which the weights are applied.
Yeah, I'm just assuming EEE would be duplicative of pre-K anyway, right?
The file that I have separates EEE and pre-K.
For payment, but it's still a student. The many students who are eligible for EEE are also enrolled in pre-kindergarten.
Correct. Yes.
Is probably captured.
That's a good point. So it's hard to look at all of these just counts and gain any sort of pattern from them. So then I looked at the percentage of the state's students in certain grades by region. So what we're looking at here is each of these columns should be sort of taken distinctly. So looking at the pre-K column, because it's the first one, these are the percentage in each region of the state's total pre-K population. So 6% of the state's pre-K population is in Addison. 5% of the state's pre-K population is in Bennington, and so on and so forth. And then I did the same thing for elementary, middle, secondary total. So what I think is really interesting to see here is that regions have really similar distribution of students in certain grades. The widest distribution, so the widest spread is in Bennington, which has 5% of the state's pre-K population and 8% of the state's secondary grade population. And so this is the widest point difference. I then did a similar analysis for the regions for students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. Here we can see that they really do vary by region. So what we're looking at here in the table is the count of long-term ADM students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds and the percentage of the region's long-term ADM that is from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. So that's what we're seeing here. This next column, we're looking at within each region, what percentage does that region have of the state's total students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds? So there's a lot of information in each one of these tables. But what we're seeing here is that among regions, Kingdom North has the highest percentage of its pupils that are from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. And Eastern Chittenden has the lowest percentage of its pupils, wherever it is here, from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. But then interestingly, when you zoom out and you say, okay, statewide, which district has the highest and lowest share of the state's students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, then we see that Central Vermont has the highest share of the state's overall count of students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, while Addison has the lowest.
So I don't think this is a question, so I'm just gonna say it. But one way I'm sort of thinking about some of the policy implications of this is we talk about
there's proposals for student weights, and then there's also, we heard some testimony last week about adding another weight for sort of concentrations of poverty, which is different from just a count of poverty. And so those weights might be applied differently based on sort of these two ways of measuring poverty.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Madam Chair, don't you essentially get that concentration by those weighted students that are all in one area anyway?
I think what the testimony that we heard was that there's sort of the cost to educate a student living in poverty or from a economically disadvantaged background. And then if there's a high enough concentration of students from an economically disadvantaged population in a single district or a single school, there might be value in adding an additional weight for that concentration because that shifts the cost curve a little bit.
So the weight by itself isn't enough.
Yes, there would be sort of a secondary weight for concentration.
Michigan did, right?
What?
I think that's what Michigan did.
Maybe,
Yeah.
or Wisconsin? I don't know which one. Sorry, I meant Minnesota. Sorry to mix them up. Ugh, very different
One of those
places.
places out there.
Such different places. I genuinely think they're different.
Julie, you've done a whole lot of work and broken it out in a lot of different ways. But you're aware of the testimony we've heard from other witnesses with regards to the government, the 5 districts or however many districts. Bits and pieces in play, the individualized looks that you've taken, things, will be very useful. But if we come up with different districts, right, they we'll have to pull things from various sources and come up with a new map or a new, right? Okay, you're not, I mean, you understand where I'm going.
Yeah,
So that per county, for example, or per, may not be as relevant as it appears, except for a process of trying to sort this out.
absolutely. And I think that, you know, leading with our disclaimer slide about like the purpose of the joint fiscal office, I'm here to provide information to help you understand how grand list.
And I appreciate exactly what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. Yes.
So we don't get ourselves out over our skis, so.
Thank you, yes. And I will say that the background work of this analysis was yes, some work because it required prorating district grand lists, town grand lists to district levels based off of pupil ratios, which is not something I've had to do before. And so that's also a policy consideration of just something to be mindful of when considering which school districts go with which school districts. If they're crossing town lines, I can't even speak for my ledge council counterpart drafting wise, but in terms of the modeling, we can pull the numbers together and there's other considerations underlying there.
Thank you, Madam Chairs. Just to pick up on this line of questioning, I mean, I appreciate that there's more analysis here than just grand list, that you're looking at the types of pupils that would be in each kind of district. And because I think that's helpful too, when we're just looking at grand list. I mean, I know we're the tax committees, we're just looking at one kind of measurement of what might be a logical district rather than looking at a much broader picture. So when you bring in the types of pupils, that helps, but there are also geographic considerations like town lines, you know, mountains and rivers and floodplains and all those things too, but also where our current schools are located, because that's where the kids are going to school right now. And we're gonna have to take the logic of our current system and move it to the logic of a new system if we're gonna do this. And ignoring the logic of our current system will just make it much harder. So it seems to me that there's gotta be a much broader analysis than just looking at the financials. It's gotta be like, how do people actually live in this state and where do they go to school? And how does making the new districts make sense layered on that?
I'm gonna offer so I asked Julia to do this round of analysis based on these new regions, which were sort of smaller than the proposal from the administration, but still sort of logical, and the SBA sentences, a little bit of testimony sort of reflecting this. But the House Education Committee is starting the process of doing some real GIS mapping around some of this. And I think that will certainly be necessary if we're gonna make any decisions on this. Totally agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah, school sheds, like watersheds or labor sheds or whatever, right?
Sheds.
School sheds, school sheds, that's not, doesn't really fit in. But it will exceed me.
Do we, no, I may have forgotten this, but what did go into the creation of the 5 districts? I don't remember being given a metric for what was used.
I don't know if there's anyone in this room who could speak to that.
Okay.
question.
The fact is,
It's the,
it's the superintendent's associations that are already set up. That's what they.
Beyond that, there was no, okay, thank you.
Starting point.
Started, right,
Yeah.
okay.
Take it down.
And since we're all sort of remembering, the superintendent's districts are designed just to make more efficient Zoom meetings amongst colleagues. They're not about anything educational at all.
So with all due respect, it wasn't presented to us as a starting point. It was actually presented as these are the 5 districts. So I'm just a little confused, and clarity would be helpful if anyone has any.
Maybe we can get a future witness on. for that.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else on this slide for anyone?
I guess to broaden on that, I do see this as a better starting point. This seems much more rational. And so I'm not saying I'm fully endorsing this configuration, but it seems to have a spread of pupil size across districts that is defendable and worth further exploration than the 5 district model that was initially presented.
Getting closer.
By automobile. We can navigate closely. If you love today. Julia, can we see the next?
Yes. If I may, before we move on to the next slide,
Want to say?
one more piece that I think is worth noting is, we're seeing, this is telling us a couple of different things when we're looking at and maybe I should have led with this when we're looking at the pupil demographics. When it's telling us about, the makeup of these different regions, it's also telling us about weighting capacity, right? So if they're under current law, we have a weight for students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. Under the proposed foundation formula, there would still be a weight for these students. So it also tells us a sense of additional dollars associated with certain weights in the proposed model or additional taxing capacity under the current system.
Something else that I noticed here is that a high percentage of students from an economically disadvantaged background does not necessarily exactly correlate with the grand list values in that community, or which I might say might be a proxy for the wealth in that community, and that often you could have quite wealthy, the wealth of a community and the demographics of the students in its public school are not necessarily perfect. Yes.
Could say just
Oh, I'm so
simply
sorry.
that some of these regions are more unequal within the region than some others. That's what this slide tells me.
And also likely within these regions and further.
No, that's what I was trying to say. Yeah.
So I think I have one more slide of tables. And this is our English learning students in Vermont. So what we're looking at here is the share of pupils identified as English learners and how it varies among region. Data suppression requires below 11 to be suppressed, which is why nothing is suppressed here. And we can read this table in a very similar way to how we read the prior table. So what we're seeing here is first within a region, its count of English learners within the region. And then the percentage of a region's long-term ADM that are English learners. And then this far right column is telling us what percentage that region has of the state's total English learning students. So we see that Western Chittenden has the highest percentage of among regions of its English learners. And Kingdom North has the lowest percentage. These are rounded, but Kingdom North is lower. And statewide, Western Chittenden has the highest share of the state's English learning students, and Kingdom North has the lowest share. Again, rounded, but Kingdom North.
Would you, the concentration escalator, or choosing a better word, I'd be curious if, to revisit that, if it would be considered across all of these different weights or considerations, or if it would just be focused on the economically disadvantaged. I see Rebecca.
The testimony that we took, I have no idea when that was, sometime in the last month. Instead talked about having English language learning weights be about sort of levels of proficiency, with an extra weight for a student who had been out of school for a long time, say living in a refugee camp for most of their life. Interestingly, under the current weights, there's actually a grant for a low concentration. So that's sort of a funny almost flip on the whole thing, because if you have a very, very low concentration, you might need enough money to make up the difference that your weights wouldn't make up. Yeah, Representative.
That's what I was gonna say, is this may actually work the opposite way, whereas if you have density, you actually can have specialized staff and enough to run classes, where it's actually very difficult if it's the only child in your school.
And this is my final slide, some considerations that I just wanted to raise that we're looking at, and these are similar to what I presented in your committees before. You know, this analysis is looking at fiscal year 2025 data. So it's not addressing changes to evaluations, student counts, demographics in future years, which are likely to shift. And those shifts may not be uniform, likely will not be uniform across the state. We're not looking at variance within the regions or proposed districts for grand list. So we're not looking at, you know, how many parcel counts are there? What are the range of property values? We're not looking at all of the weighting categories under current law, nor all of the categories discussed in the administration's proposal. For instance, there's a sparsity weight. We didn't talk about sparsity here. And again, and this was mentioned earlier, but I think it bears repeating that we're not talking about the variance within regions or within districts of student demographics. So where there may be a more significant concentration of a certain group of students within one of these larger regions.
I don't know how, this is pretty impressive, so thank you. This is a tremendous amount of work to generate this presentation. I want to honor that. We have seen this larger Vermont trend of concentration of opportunity and erosion of population in certain places. Has anyone ever done this historically so we can compare and sort of guesstimate what some of those longer trends are and what that might?
Not that I'm aware of. I haven't seen any other analyses like this. That being said, there very well could be them, and I just haven't seen them, but I'm not aware of any. But it would be certainly interesting to look at. One challenge would be crosswalking against the mergers and divorces of districts that we've seen over the previous years.
And we've counted some of these students differently over years.
Yeah, we saw significant change, especially on the counting of students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, both from Act 127, and then we also have the Medicaid direct certification pilot, which has picked up a lot more students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds.
Well, thank you very much. So we are going to take a break until 2:45. When Jake Feldman will join us. And we